Welcome to Parsha Hour, your Parsha Hour, 12 noon Thursdays. I hope you join us every week. We're always here learning the Parsha. And actually, that's not true. We just got started again. We were off for a few weeks, and I have to tell you, it's Parshat Noach, second reading in the cycle. And it feels like Parshat Noach in Los Angeles. It's like, starting to get, the rains are coming down. We're praying for rain. I think it's supposed to rain tomorrow. It's cloudy where I am. And it feels like Parshat Noach, and that feels good. It feels good to be in that Parsha rhythm. It's something that is really central to my own religious life. It's just like being in this rhythm. The tradition says you should read the Parsha twice every week in the original and once in translation. Various versions of how to do that, but that's the idea, is always being in the Parsha, and always, the 50 of us that are on this call, we're in the same conversation every week, right? We have a story that we're thinking about every week, and we can talk to each other about it all week long. And we gather here after having read it a little bit and thought about it a little bit. So that's just a very important practice to me, and I encourage it. I encourage you to read the Parsha regularly. Have read it before you come here. If you have the chance. It's a really good rhythm to have in your life, and it is, after all, a Shabbat rhythm. It's a weekly rhythm, which is maybe the central rhythm of our Jewish lives. So good to be in the Parsha. Speaking of Parsha, some of you know we now have a Parsha class and a Parsha podcast. So if you can't make it, or if you just want to supplement, or if you want to share the Parsha with friends or whatever, a new format now for digesting Torah. I think Jess is going to put it in the chat. We're calling it Best Book Ever, and that's because the Torah is in fact the best book ever, or at least that's what I'm here to try and prove. And we're gonna and so I'll do a little 15-minute mini lesson every week, and I promise that it's not going to be. It may be related sometimes. It's not going to be the same thing we do here. So, if you're just Parsha nuts like I am, then you can do both. But otherwise, whatever. That's just share that around and let folks know if you're so inclined, and if you like what we do here, I want to give people a little teaser without them having to sit through a whole class. But we like class, don't we? Yes, we do. Okay, so let's get started. Let's say a blessing over our learning today, a blessing that ends la'asok b'divrei Torah, to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, now what we're going to do today, I think, is very, very important, and I've never done it before. I've always had a feeling about this, but I've never actually really begun to. This is my first foray into this particular reading of Parshat Noach, of the story of Noah. And the reading that I want us to try and do together today is to look for what exactly was religion like. And religion, some people say, is not a very Jewish word, right? Because by the time we get to what we call Judaism, it's so much more than religion. It's it's a whole civilization, as Kaplan put it. But I'm thinking religion. I'm thinking, what were Noah's religious practices? Who was Noah, and what was that world like? And I think that this is important, not just as a kind of curious speculation, but because we have to ask that question in order to figure out exactly what kind of religion or relationship to God the Torah is presenting us with, or encouraging. Because our religious tradition, you might say, starts with Abraham, right? And that's next week. It's just next week. And we get to it very quickly, but you might think, well, why is Noah there at all? And, especially because some of our lore and legend around Abraham is that he emerged in the midst of chaos, and he emerged in the midst of idolatry. It was just like paganism everywhere, and there was no such thing as the recognition of God. And Abraham, boom, saw it, Mr. Monotheist, right? But then that doesn't really work with the Torah's narrative entirely, because they're talking Adam, Eve, Noah, everybody's talking to God. God's there. In fact, in some ways, God's more there, or at least as much there as God is for Abraham. So, what one way to think about it is that Noah is a kind of a foil for Abraham, and we're going to see today many ways in which Noah actually has all kinds of, we don't pay much attention to them, but it has all kinds of religious behaviors that act as a kind of prelude to Abraham. So that we don't have to keep that comparison in mind. But there's a bigger issue here, which is, how does the Torah present the evolution of God's relationship with humanity, and why does it move through Noah to manifest into Abraham in the narrative? Let me just to give you a sense of what kind of imagining I want to do with you today, or try with you today. I want to give you, I'll give you all a source sheet, but I just want to look at the first source altogether. This is a famous passage in Maimonides' Laws of Idolatry. And he talks about, well, where does idolatry come from? And Maimonides sort of puts together, based on what he knows, but there's a way in which he also imagines an early history, meaning what happens after Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden when they know that there is a God, right? Like Adam and Eve are in dialogue. Again, just the narrative of the Torah. It's like some of this feels like prehistory, but Maimonides tries to imagine how it might have been history. And he says, after the lapse of a long time, the glorified and awful name, or awful, it doesn't seem like a great, but awesome name, was forgotten to be mentioned by the mouth of all substance, all that is, and blotted, I didn't retranslate this, so forget the translation, and blotted out from their consciousness, so that they gave God no recognition. So Maimonides, just listen to this. Maimonides is imagining God must have been forgotten, right? Like Maimonides, given the Adam and Eve story, and as we'll soon see, given the Noah story, can't say nobody had thought of God, because that just doesn't exactly work. God is around doing things. So the narrative of the Torah has to imagine that God was present and then was forgotten, as a consequence whereof all the people of the earth, as well as women and little children, it's not people, and this translation is bad. The men of the earth, as well as the women and little children, knew not save the image of wood and stone. There's paganism. Now he's imagining paganism. The stony temple wherein they were brought up for their infancy to bow down to it. Now he's just sort of imagining various kinds of idolatry, to worship it and swear by its name. As for their wise men, for example, their priests and their like, they supposed that there was no God save the stars and planets, for whose sake and in whose likeness those images were made. But the Rock of Ages, that's our God, was but the Rock of Ages, not a man was there to recognize God or know God. Nobody knew God, except, and then this is an incredible addition, except save some individuals in the whole world. For example, Enoch, Chanoch in Hebrew, Enoch, Methuselah, Noah, Shem, and Ever. Except for, like, in other words, except for one family. But isn't that the Jewish story? Except for one family. So it's like, this is like a pre-Abraham, a Judaism, of course, is not the right word, but as we'll soon see, a pre-covenant or a pre-relationship with God. And on this path, the world continued its course of circuity until the birth of the firmest pillar of the world, Abraham, our father. Well, that's quite a nice flourish at the end, but like, is Abraham that big a deal if, Abraham emerged, but Noah was just doing that? Or what was Noah doing? And that's the question I want to ask today. And I've been talking now for a while, so I want to open up the conversation. And we're not just going to speculate, we're going to read the text, right? Our work here is in the text of the Torah, and not just theology. So we're going to try to mine the story of Noah for evidence of his religious practices or life, or what exactly was going on there. And I think there are at least three important moments to think about. And the first one, and here I'm going to give you a source sheet. The first one is just the first verse of the story of Noah, Parshat Noach. And the first verse is famous, but it's famous because usually what people are talking about is the fact that Noah is called a tzaddik, a righteous man. righteous man in his generation. Nobody else in the Torah is explicitly called a righteous man. So this is thought of as a big deal, and Noah was a big deal. Story of Noah, the guy saves all the animals and humanity. Man, that is a big deal. But a lot of people focus on this first verse as some evidence of who was this guy. This is the line of Noah. Noah was a pure and righteous man in his generation. Noach ish tzadik tamim haya badorotav. Okay, was a righteous man. That's great, and that means something. But righteous can mean a lot of things. But we don't pay as much attention to the last phrase in that verse. Et ha-Elohim hitalech Noach. And Noah walked with God. And Noah walked with God. Okay, now, just so we can begin to, I could keep going here for a sec. This is like a pregnant phrase. Noah walked with God. What is that? But let's just stop and ask, what does that mean? What might that mean? Noah was a righteous man, and Noah walked with God. Just as not any explanation there. What do you hear from that? What does that mean that Noah walked with God? It can't be literal, right? So what is it? Can someone just give us some because we're gonna analyze this phrase for a while.
Can I?
I gotta start with Noah Pollock.
Okay.
Gotta start with Noah Pollock.
Okay, and coincidentally enough, my Hebrew name is Noah, but I think that Rambam's source, it seemed like akin to the Tower of Babel narrative that's also in this week's Torah portion, that they're building this tower to like worship the heavens and whatever, but walking with God, that seems...
Can I interrupt you? Because you just said something important, and then I'm going to come back to you. Noah wants us to remember, okay, I've asked us to do this sort of step back, imagine the whole narrative unraveling of the Torah. And Noah's quite right that, yeah, part of how we might answer or speak of what Maimonides is talking about is that you have the Noah story, which takes us through chapter 10. And then in chapter 11, you have the Tower of Babel, and that's the chapter before Abraham. So maybe the Tower of Babel represents some decline in civilization, some forgetting. The rabbis are looking for these sorts of clues when they're trying to imagine how religion develops, and Noah points that out wisely. So that's so thank you for that. And then you were going to say, and the phrase itself, Noah walked with God.
Yeah, in Idolatry Hashem, that seems like when God was walking in the Garden of Eden, and like Adam and Eve later realized they were naked, but that can't be all there is. Maybe it's the actions Noah and his family take in listening to the divine, and then even though no one else wanted to listen, but that family listened. Okay,
brilliant connection you just made, Noah. And I didn't think we were going to get this quickly, so I saved it for later. But it's on our source sheet. Noah, first of all, and I saw I saw this pop up in the chat. I don't have time to look at the chat, unfortunately, so I don't usually see the chat. But sometimes so I know there's a whole separate conversation that goes on there, and I think that's great. But I don't. But I heard someone say, "Wait, what about what Noah walked?" This phrase "walked" is not. It's a little hard to explain. Just if you're not in the Hebrew, but the word for it in grammar is reflexive. It's a reflexive verb. Hitalech is different than halach. Noah walked, literally walked or went, and that's the more common. This is reflexive, meaning it is either describing something one does to oneself or with oneself, like mitlabesh, I get dressed, or it describes a process, something that is in process, and I am in the walking. I am in modern Hebrew, mitalech is a little bit like to stroll, like to be on a walk. Right, and I invite Yonatan or any Hebrew speakers to add nuance here. But the point is, this is not a common use of walked. It's a certain kind of walking, and so Noah does what we want to do in this class is to think about, okay, so what are the textual connections here? How do we understand this particular act of walking? And Noah reminds us, it's funny, I keep saying Noah because now I'm talking about Noah Pollock, but Noah keeps reminding us, Noah reminds us that the first use of that verb is in last week's reading, and it describes the sound of God walking or moving through the garden. This is Adam and Eve. They ate the fruit, and then v'yishma'u et kol Adonai Elohim mitalech bagan. They heard the sound of God moving through the garden, strolling through the garden, walking through the garden. Okay, so that's a really important connection because it's the first usage of this. And I'll tell you, I went looking, and it isn't common in the book of Genesis. We're going to look at a couple of examples, but it isn't so common, this verb. And so Noah wonders, does it mean that it is about being in they heard God walking through the garden. So to walk with God perhaps is to be attentive to the way God, to the sound of God. Maybe it's this, to walk with God means someone who heard the voice of God and walked on. I think that would be a great definition. Or is it, I walk along with God? All right, lots of possibilities here. I want to take a couple more and then begin to do a little deepening by Noah already started us off this way, but there's more comparative work to do here. Matt Silverstein, what's your read of this walking with God?
I want to say it's a bit more literal than that. I want to say it is a bit more because this God, at this point, he's going to be smelling the sacrifice. I think it's a physically with, and I think this connects to your question, because I would say that Noah doesn't have a religion because Noah has God. That religion is for those of us who don't actually listen to God and walk with God and have God say, hey, don't do that. Yeah. So we have a religion and we have a process. And to connect to idolatry, they make a God because they want that. They take a stone.
They want a physical thing.
A physical thing. They don't have the guy actually walking. Hey, I'm going to go talk to God today. And he's out in the fields with God with him. Yeah. So they make a stone.
Okay, great. Matt, as usual, is playing with fire, but as usual in a very helpful way, right? Because Matt is saying, look, I know, Rabbi Kasher, you're in the tradition, post-Maimonides tradition, and everything's just abstract and God is just a force. But no, it says he walked with God. So the Torah has physical descriptions of God. God smells things. So let's, I don't have to say God is physical, but let's at least imagine that this is about a physical, I move about with God. I feel God's presence. I am with God, right? Yeah, I started to say, I hear the voice of God. And that's I'm out there in the desert and I receive God's message, the desert fathers, right? As they speak of in some Christian traditions. And okay, so Noah hears the voice of God, but Matt's saying, no, it's like Noah wanted to be with God and he is. I mean, God talks to him directly. So they're in a relationship and Matt says, and so it's not really a religion. It's someone who has direct contact. It's someone who has direct contact. What does it mean to be walking with God? Someone who just is in direct dialogue with God. And maybe there's a kind of physical element to that, God's presence, which Matt imagines also devolving or paralleling even more physical representations of God. Okay, I want to keep taking comments, but especially as Matt mentions especially as Matt suggests that this we don't need to describe as religion. It's just God. It's just direct contact. I want to hold on though a little bit to the idea that to walk with God is a particular religious act or a particular religious kind of life, spiritual kind of life. And I want to do that by drawing the most obvious comparison, the comparison that we have to keep doing with Noah through the whole story, which is the comparison to Abraham. Okay, and most of the time, our tradition, the rabbis have most of the time decided, this is what partially what the podcast is about, so check that out. But most of the time, the tradition decided, if you're comparing Noah and Abraham, Noah sucks and Abraham, what's the positive? Rules. Abraham's is good, Noah bad, because the build up to Abraham suggests something that didn't work with Noah. So the rabbis will compare Noah and Abraham and always say that, oh yeah, they were similar in some ways, but Abraham was better. So here's an example. Noah walked with it. This is Rashi, our greatest commentator. And Rashi says, Noah walked with God. But in the case of Abraham, it says, and this is a quote from Genesis, Abraham says, Hitalachti lefanav. Or actually, I think this is his servant quoting him. God before whom I walked. Same language there. Hitalachti lefanav. And why? What's the difference? Just think about it. Noah walked with God. Abraham walked before God. Okay, so it's a little bit of a different phrasing. And the rabbi sees on that and they say, because Noah needed God's support to keep him up, whereas Abraham strengthened himself and walked in righteousness on his own. Noah had to walk with God. Abraham, it's a sort of funny thing, Abraham walked way out ahead of God. He could stand on his own. Now, that's an example of the kind of rabbinic diss of Noah that you'll see again and again in the Midrash. But the diss itself belies the obvious comparison between the two. Like, the rabbis are only trying to contend with the fact that this language that Noah gets is unusual, and we see it most prominently repeated with Abraham. So let's take a look. It's funny to me that they quoted chapter 24, that Rashi quoted chapter 24, because chapter 17 is the most prominent example of it. When Avram, this is before he got his name Abraham, when Avram was 99 years old, the Eternal appeared to Avram and said to him, Ani El Shaddai, I am El Shaddai, Hitalech lefanai, walk before me, Hitalech lefanai. And if it wasn't enough a parallel to Noah, Ve'yeh tamim, and be pure. Remember that language? That's also right up there. Noah was pure and righteous, and he walked with God. So now we're really at the crux of the matter, which is, what is it that Noah was doing that Abraham did? How are those two figures engaged in the same kind of religious dialogue or practice or walking with God? Okay, turn it back out to the floor. Payam.
I think they're radically different. I think Noah prayed with his feet. Noah had a tangible, almost a physical relationship with God that involved, almost like a pilgrimage, walking, being in nature. It didn't have an intellectual relationship that Abraham and Moses have. And if you look at the language when God talks to Abraham, it's a commandment: walk before me, because Abraham sort of forgot that type of relationship that Noah had with God. So God is telling him it's not all intellectual, just walk before me. And that's, the reason we have Abraham and Moses above Noah is the Enlightenment influence on it all, that intellectualism is far better than, practicing, which then.
Okay, I love both things that you're saying. Let me start with the second, which is that and this echoes Matt's suggestion, that it's important that there's actually something physical about this. We call our religious practice nowadays halacha, which we often translate as Jewish law. But the translation is same language, the walking or the going. Okay, so and Payam suggests, and that notion goes all the way back, that you serve God through your being and doing and walking. What is the first message that Abraham receives? Lech lecha, walk, go, be action oriented in the world. And it's, Payam says very precisely and wisely, that's a distinction. That's an important distinction from the kind of abstract, intellectual, faith-based internal religion that maybe we've inherited since the Middle Ages, or maybe again since the Enlightenment. Okay, that's an important point. But Payam said another thing which I thought was really interesting, which is that Payam's reading of the difference between walk with God and walk before, the rabbis want to make Abraham better, but Payam's saying almost like, no, Noah was all the way with God. Abraham had to come back to where Noah was. Noah actually is the archetype. And Abraham's trying to rediscover Noah's God. I should say here, Maimonides mentioned Noah and his sons, Shem and Aver. Another rabbinic legend that moves through the tradition is the idea that, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they would go to yeshiva. They call it yeshiva. They would go to yeshiva. Where did they get all this knowledge about God? They went to the yeshiva of Shem ve'Aver, of Noah's son and grandson, Shem ve'Aver. They say that all the time. Where was Isaac? Doesn't come back from the binding of Isaac at the end of the story. Where did he go? Went to the yeshiva of Shem ve'Aver. Like that's a trope, and the trope represents this idea that this is just a powerful and fascinating idea, that there were always people who knew that this thing that we do, that call out to God and have a relationship with the one true God and follow God's will, there were always people who were tuned into that. There's a tradition of people who kept the faith. And sometimes it was only very few people, and maybe Abraham was more successful than Noah, but Noah was doing that, and Noah was in touch with the same God. Now, the implications of that, and we'll circle back around to them at the end of class, implications of that are potentially quite profound, because Noah is not Jewish, right? Or Israelite, or Abrahamic, or, right? Noah's something else, something universal. So the idea that Noah's also doing it is going to be important just for our whole theology. Okay, I want to let's take a couple more comments, and then I want to move us forward. But just so that we're ready to pick up and move forward, let me show you one more text just to fill out the picture. We're spending most of our time with this phrase because this is the phrase that kind of triggered my investigation of walking with God. I want to show you one more major instance of it that occurs between God's walking through the garden and Noah. And it's an earlier figure. Maimonides already mentioned him. I don't know why they call him Enoch, but in Hebrew it's Hanoch. So Hanok, right? But in the lineage that leads up to Noah, and the Torah gives a lot of lineages up at the start, this is perhaps the most interesting instance of walking with God. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he'd got Methuselah. Methuselah is going to be the oldest person, as we're famous for being the oldest person in the Torah. And after the birth of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God. There it is. V'yitalech Chanoch. So now this is a big deal. You have Abraham, Noah, and freaking Enoch? Like, who's he? What? Now, there are Gnostic traditions, and Enoch has his own book, right? Like, people start to riff on this a lot because this phrase suggests that there was something going on kind of randomly in prehistory with this guy. And he begot sons and daughters. And then now this is interesting. All the days of Enoch came to 365 years. No idea whether that's intended to parallel the cycle of the year or pre that precise calculation. So maybe not, I don't know. But anyway, it mentions it one more time. Enoch walked with God, v'yitalech Chanoch, as if to emphasize, v'yitalech Chanoch et Elohim, and then he was no more. Ve'inenu, ki lakach oto Elohim. And then he was no more, for God took him. Well, that's a new layer, right? This is the first person to be described as walking with God. And then suddenly, Einenu, he was no, now maybe he just died. But that's weird language. God took him. Okay, so let's just take a couple more thoughts on now what with the big picture we've seen of this early tradition of walking with God and what it means and the way that it might in the case of Hanoch imply such a close relationship that it absorbs you or something. Okay, Mark Strunin. Welcome.
Well, that last thing you just said threw me for a twist.
Yeah, right.
Backing away from that. Go all the way back to the creation of Adam and then Chava. Adam was not a human being like we're human beings. Adam was a slightly less than divine human beings. Certainly the Zohar portrays Adam as possessing both male, female, and beyond characteristics. There's a tremendous sense of Adam being so capable. But what happens is the whole saga through the whole narrative through Breshit goes from this epitome, the apex that the created Adam represents, into diminishment. Adam and Chava, they get in trouble. They're thrown out of the garden. Their sons bring murder and frustration into the world, and it continues through. Eventually, even suggests the Tower of Babel that will comes, and then it's all the stories about the Nephilim and the Bnei Elohim, these intermediary presences that interact, and it's a saga of the diminishment of humanity from the apex of Adam.
Great.
So we're right, and just let me wrap it up with, and so Noah's walking with God is one more pilot test on God's part that it might be possible. And isn't this the time when the Noahide laws come into play?
We'll get there. We'll get there. So let me just stop. You're getting us everything and so much good stuff. So the narrative that you are describing is, I think, a classic reading, maybe the most classic, certainly the one that I heard the most in my schooling, in how to understand these first three parshot of the Torah and the appearance of Noah in particular, which is that there's some, exactly as Mark said, that there's some like good, solid, precise contact that Adam and Eve have with God, and that's ideal, but it's almost like transcendently ideal. And then there's like a failure and a fall, and until Abraham, there's this constant attempt and failure to recreate a relationship with God. And so you see various failures, and Tower of Babel maybe is the last, but Noah is the, and I always heard it described to me this way, is that God tried with humanity and wanted to and that didn't work. And then God tried with one family to restart humanity, and that didn't work. And then God thought, okay, what if I just take one tribe and let them kind of do their thing, and they'll spread my message throughout the world. This is the way that I sort of often heard the narration of this prehistory in the Torah, the meaning of that prehistory. That's certainly a strong reading. Failure, and God's failure sometimes. I regret that I created humanity. But I'm in some ways trying to push us to do a different thing today, which is to say, well, wait, but what was working? Because Noah was doing something right? Obviously, Noah's doing, and so was Hanoch. And maybe not just something right, but something basic, something, the core of what we talk about is religion. Okay. I regret not being able to turn immediately to hands up, but I want to, well, let me take the hands that I've seen from before, and then we'll move into the next section. Okay, I want to try to keep this as neat as possible and not leave people hanging. So I'm going to take Leah and Florine, and then we're going to look at another section.
Okay, I see it as honing the covenant. Noah, I want you to do this. And this is, you do that, I'm going to do this. It's a simple agreement. And then when it's all over, I think we get the first, Hashem says, I'm going to give you a rainbow. I'm never going to do this again. I think he says somewhere, I promise, I'm never going to do it again. This is the first agreement, that covenantal agreement that God is offering to us. I think it's the rainbow.
Okay, great. Leah, I'm going to stop you because we're going to head there. We're going to head there. So I think I'm sensing the moment, right, that you and Mark are wanting to take us forward, and we're going to get there. But I'm just going to we haven't seen that material yet. So I'm just going to pause you for a sec. Florine, do you have any further thoughts on the walking with God piece in particular?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions about the word to walk. For me, the whole definition here is not external walking, it's internal walking. And it's particularly because it's a reflexive verb. And I don't know the deepness of the reflexive verb in Hebrew as opposed to in English. But I feel the following. It means take steps within oneself. And that's a conscious decision one makes. And if one believes that all is one, that it's mutual, that God is also walking within us. So I start off from a totally different perspective of the word walk. Now, where you're going to draw the contrast, I'm lost.
Okay. So this is great. Florine, that's a nice kind of coda to what we've been doing, because Florine, with ever the poet's ear, is really thinking about, well, so what does it mean to have a reflexive walking? So maybe it's happening within oneself. There's some inner process here. The inner walking, taking steps within oneself is a beautiful way to describe it. Now, that's a good place to move on. And I'm going to circle back to you, Leah, because I regret to have to cut you off because you're heading in exactly the right direction. But that is to say, I want to now move away from this phrase of walking with God, because there is something about it that seems so intensely personal, individual, primal. I mean, what does it mean to walk with God? On the one hand, it feels like that's a particular religious orientation or spiritual orientation. On the other hand, as many of you have said, that's not even religion. That's just being in touch. Okay, but what about Noah's religion? Why would I use that word? And there are indications, as Leah was pointing to, as Mark was pointing to, that actually it's not just this one phrase that Noah shared with Abraham, but Noah's laying the ground for a lot of what we come to think of as the Hebrew religion. And the next great moment of that, next great instant, right? Most of the story is sailing around on an ark, right? So that's like we're just waiting for the waters to subside. But the next great instance of something, and now I think we're getting into overt religious rituals, is that Noah builds an altar. Okay? When Noah came out, so Noah, they came out together with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. Every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, everything that stirs on the earth came out of the ark by families. Vayiven Noach mizbeach l'Hashem. And then Noah built an altar to the eternal. This is the first altar that we have in the Torah. Okay? Noah invented the altar. It's not the first sacrifice. Cain and Abel made sacrifices. But Noah invented the altar, and Abraham he's going to go wild with altars. Abraham builds altars all over the place. And we go wild with altars too, right? Like the altar is the central religious, like the center of our religion to a certain extent, right? It's there at the heart of the temple. And now, just if that weren't enough, look, he takes every pure animal and every pure bird. Oh, that's like Leviticus language, right? God, by the way, said, take pure animals and impure animals. We don't even know why God says that until suddenly Noah seems to get it. He's like, oh, you offer pure animals on the altar. And he offered burnt offerings on the altar. Same language that we use later when we talk in Leviticus about offering. V'yal olot b'mizbeach. And Matt mentioned this earlier, and the Eternal smelled the pleasing odor, reach nichoach, which is another phrase we'll see in Leviticus, but here we can't help but notice that it sounds like the smell, the reich nichoach, the pleasant smell, sounds like the reich Noach. It's the smell that Noah came up with, right? There's a little bit of wordplay there. But okay, the Eternal spoke in its heart, never again will I doom the earth because of humanity, since the devisings of the human mind are evil from its youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living being as I have done. Okay, so something seems to work, but the point is, Noah built an altar. Noah built an altar, and that's a religious form that, I mean, that's an explicitly religious form, and one that Noah comes up with, and then Abraham runs with it. Abraham runs with it. So I don't know, maybe I'm making too much of like, an altar. It's like saying a table. They had tons of altars back then. But this language of mizbeach that becomes so central to our tradition, I think we have to reckon with the Noahide introduction of the altar. So let's think about that a little bit. I see hands from before. Raise your hand if this is a good moment for you to come in. Those of you who had your hands up. Okay, Alexandra, and then Robert.
So I'm looking at this and in a new way for me, and I'm very like moved by this conversation and the text. To me, and I was wondering, like, so God, why did you get rid of Enoch? Like, why did you take him away from the earth when the earth obviously needed him? And I was thinking that maybe one of the points of this story is as a mystical metaphor, how when the mystical metaphor being that one person who walks with God can save the entire world, and an extension of the idea that you save one life, you save the whole world. And this Kabbalistic idea that when we connect to God, we are so much more powerful than we think we are. And what an amazing thing. If only one person connects to God, we can say, like, that one person can save the whole world. And so if that one person creates the space through creating the altar, that's an extension of that concept, possibly.
Okay, I love what you've done there, Alexandra, because you really picked up and extracted one of the threads that we've been seeing. We saw it from Maimonides right at the start, but we haven't really articulated it, which is the idea that what Noah is about and what Enoch is about is the idea of an unbroken chain. That like, it's not just that there was a proto-religion or there's some spare, but one way of reading this, and again, this is like, we're talking about like Adam and Eve and like the flood, like this is pre-history. This is like not even, this is mythology, like big stories, you know, that mean more than they mean literally. There's like, what are the origins of humanity? And one way to read it is, there was always, exactly the way Maimonides reads it, there was always someone who knew. And thank God the chain went unbroken, because Abraham was the one who picked it up. But like, Abraham learned at the yeshiva Shem Va'ever, and Noah was setting the ground for Abraham. And that's important, because that means that the tradition doesn't just go back to this one guy, but actually maybe it's important for the theology of the Torah to say this religion goes back to the God who created the world. There's a through line there, and there was always someone who knew. So I think that's a very, very important framework that you're giving us there, or at least one possible interpretation of this sequence. Robert?
Yeah, I really like this conversation a lot. So I'm thinking that we're looking from the point of view of Adam and Noah and Abraham, and that's a really important evolution. And I think also there's an evolution that seems like from God's point of view too. He's trying to figure out, well, how do I reach these people? They're trying to say, how can I reach God? They want to walk with God. I think God wants to walk with people too, but he doesn't really know how to do it. It's not really working, and he's trying these different things out, and it doesn't quite work out with Adam. But then he gets to Noah, and with Noah, yeah, he does have actually. He has a brit. He has a covenant. He makes a covenant with Noah, and it's very similar to, well, they use the same words. He uses a brit, the language of brit, with Abraham too, but it's more powerful with Abraham. But I think God is kind of learning. He's kind of learning his ways. How do I deal with this guy, this man thing that I've created? I guess covenants.
Yeah.
Something like that.
That's all. That is like, I'm getting just one after another, really like wonderful narrative frameworks here. We're going to save the covenant because we're going to see Leah was taking us there too, and we're going to see that in just a second. But the narrative frame that you're giving us is that, you know, again, we've seen traces of it. In fact, we just saw it in the story that God said, I made a mistake. Never again will I doom the earth because of humanity. That was a mistake. because I kept getting frustrated that they aren't just following my will, and that there's some way in which the Torah is actually saying God's trying to figure out how to deal with humanity, and it doesn't, like, don't eat that tree. They ate the tree. Don't kill your brother. They killed their brother. And don't destroy the entire earth, right? Don't murder each other, right? They keep, and Noah also, is an attempt, but it's an attempt that like involves destroying all of humanity. Is that the right solution? And that maybe as God comes upon Abraham, yes, to a certain extent, God gets one that works, but also it just tells you that God is just trying to figure this out, and it doesn't really work. And if the narrative of God and Israel tells you anything, it's that it doesn't really work very well. Like, we're not great at following God. That's not our story. And maybe no one ever was, but once in a while there's someone who is. All right. So, okay. Now, we have 12 minutes left, and Leah did this first and Robert just did it. And so I think it's important to now introduce one other critical religious form that the Noah story gives birth to, where we see it the first time, which is the covenant. The covenant. A couple of people have mentioned it. The word in Hebrew is brit, right? A bris is a covenant, right? And that's because Abraham is given the sign of the covenant, the circumcision, the bris. What is the covenant? The covenant, the Abrahamic covenant. It's all about Abraham, isn't it? But Noah gets a covenant first, and that's a wild thing. It's a striking thing. So let's just take a look at this passage, because this is really, really important. Because here we really get a sense that there might actually have been not just a guy who loved God, a guy who had religious practices, but maybe this was a guy or a family or a tradition that actually was set up to be in the same kind of commitment, partnership tradition that Abraham goes on to be in. And actually, part of the question we're asking is, how connected are these two covenants? So let's take a look. And this is the last piece of material we'll look at today. So the first covenant. So they come out of the ark, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said, be fruitful and multiply, you eat all these creatures. Okay, I want us to pick up here in verse 4, because this is going to be important. What is the covenant? So part of it is that you can now eat animals, but only certain animals. You must not, however, eat flesh with its lifeblood in it. Okay, there are certain rules coming down here. But for your own lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. I will require it of every beast, of humans too. I will require a reckoning for human life, of every man for that of his fellow human. Oh, I changed most of the man to human, but there's one. Every man for that of his human, for that of his fellow human. Whoever sheds the blood of another human, by human hands shall his blood be shed. For in God's image did God make the human being. That's the first invocation of the divine image, and the divine image as a source for an ethical code, basic ethical code. Don't murder each other. All right. Now, this is important because we're going to see, and who was it that was doing this? Mark, I think earlier was foreshadowing that from here we will get the idea that there are laws, Noahide laws. Okay, but then in the language that the Torah uses is covenant. And God said to Noah and his sons, I now establish my covenant with you and your offspring to come. Now, I am not going to read all this just because we're short on time, but I will point out one thing. And this is a modern 20th century scholar, Casuto, started doing things like this, and it kind of blew everybody's mind. And he started noticing that there are all kinds of repetitions of 7 as to emphasize key words in the Torah, right? So take a look at, like, for example, this passage where I establish my covenant, I'll maintain my covenant, this is the sign of the covenant, this is the sign of the covenant, I will remember my covenant, I will see the everlasting covenant, and this will be the sign of the covenant, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so that happens to, I've been well convinced, that's a literary technique that the Torah uses. So like 7's a big important word. So, okay. 7 words in the first verse of the Torah. Like the Kasuto goes crazy, and I don't know how far to take it, but the covenant is emphasized here, and it's a covenant that includes some kind of ethical code, moral code. And it's also a covenant that has a sign. This is the same language that's going to be used by the circumcision, but in this case, it's a much friendlier sign. It's the rainbow. Okay. All right. So, we should really like pick through this text more carefully. But I just want to give you all the information as we're coming to a close here before I take more interpretations, because now I think we really have a sense that Noah, or whatever Noah represents, I hope I've convinced you, there's a kind of what we might call a religion here, a religious life, a way of being, a covenant. They have the covenant, the sign of the covenant, prohibitions on evil behavior or immoral behavior in the name of God, of the godly image. Right? There's already like a sacred text, right? Which is the Parsha right before, right? So yes, Noah walked with God, but Noah also built altars and was in a covenant. And okay, so now what have we got here? What do we make of this proto-religion, or this just before Abraham religion that is going to have all the same language that Abraham's religion has? Okay, I've made my case. Yonatan, and then Jen.
I want to really zoom in on this issue of pure animals, right? So it's incredible to me that God says to Noah, gather 7 of every pure animal, and Noah just says, yeah, okay, I know what those are, right? And I'm going to go do that. So he knows Torah law, right? Somehow the Torah was known and transmitted at this time before there was the revelation at Sinai. And that stands to me in very sharp contrast, for example, to Yocheved, who married her nephew, and the rabbis all say, oh, well, like they didn't have the Torah at the time. They couldn't have known that wouldn't be permitted, right? So the Torah sees itself in kind of a strange way that I'm having a hard time putting together. It is. No, but I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I just love what you're saying, because it echoes a kind of rabbinic legend or tradition that like Abraham did keep the whole Torah, right? They like how could it be that our sages didn't keep the Torah? The Torah is the holiest thing ever. But it's like the way you're describing it's like the Torah's own narration is to see the idea that, not killing people, sure, someone might have come up with, but like the purity laws of Leviticus, but the Torah is saying, no, those go all the way back and no one knew them. And there was so the Torah is shaping this idea that our religion, that we are going to be, meet me at Leviticus and you'll see how it's going to have grown into this intricate system. Actually, it's the Ur religion, it's the core religion. It goes all the way back, and people always had a knowledge not just of God, but of all kinds of core spiritual truths as the Torah sees them.
Sure, and we don't know exactly what Noah did and didn't know. We know that he knew some kosher laws, but that's the extent of what we know about him and his Torah knowledge. But what stands out to me in the way that this Torah business works is that the school of thought that Noah fell into, that Shem fell into, and all these other people that you mentioned, it didn't have the sort of communal permanence that Abraham's school of thought had, right? It didn't get handed down in a way that was lasting. There wasn't the structure to contain it in that way. And I think that's really the novelty that Abraham brought into the picture.
Yeah. And look, that's a big part of why we're doing this. This is not archaeology. We're not actually like going and seeing what the remains of religion were. This is like, we're reading this book. And in order to read this book well, we have to understand why it is that the Abraham story takes off in the way that it does. And the direct parallelism between their religious practice that's part of the story that has to be taken into account. Okay, let me take, I have time for at least one more comment from Jen.
So like early on in this discussion, I wrote the word lonely down on a Post-it note in front of me, and then Amy brought it up in chat, which I thought was so cool, because we were thinking about how God must have been very lonely and reaching out for these close relationships when walking with Noah, and even taking someone out of their human life. And then I was thinking about how lonely Noah must have been after everyone that Noah knew was killed off. And this covenant that I'm reading about here, and I think we often like read it as here are laws and practices to follow. And also, I'm not going to kill you all off again. Don't you kill each other off. Cool. But I also hear God saying, like, I'm not going to make you alone again. We are going to use this covenant to establish a way where you can be close with me, but not be made alone.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to be that idea of not being alone, being with a community of people, being able to encounter God as a community and not as this isolated, lonely individual. Though still happens, right? Moses was very lonely too. Like intimate relationships with God get lonely. But like the covenant is also about how to encounter God without having to be alone, having a community with you that does not get destroyed and that is able to encounter God without being burned or flooded.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's thank you for that. That's a very powerful lens through which to regard these. Robert talked about God trying to figure out how do I deal with human beings, because it's God after all. I'm a totally different character of being, so quality of being. So one way to think about that is that God doesn't really understand. I'm not going to say this as well as Jen did, but God doesn't really understand that, yeah, it's great to be in contact with God, but people need a society. They need human beings. They need a tribe. They need, you want to talk the word religion? You need people to practice a religion with. Like, part of the reason maybe we're resistant to the idea that Noah had a religion is because it does seem like it's a communing. It's a lonely communing. And after all, what's lonelier than I'm going to kill everybody else on earth and just save you? We'll be in a relationship together. Like, that's not healthy, and Abraham, God's God's sharing Abraham a little bit. And that's just enough of a breathing space that Abraham can have a wife and a family and descendants. Okay, so that's an interesting narrative there. Okay, so I appreciate that. There's more to think about there. We have 1 minute left, and good. We went this whole time without talking about the Noahide laws. Mark was actually pointing us there earlier. But in some way, I'm talking about Noah's religion. The most classic formulation is this idea that there are 7 Noahide laws. I'm just going to read them to you real quick, and we'll end with this. But this is what you'll usually hear when people talk about Noah and Noah's religion. You'll talk about the Talmud sense, and the Talmud reads this passage here and extracts from it 7 commandments: establishing courts of justice, blasphemy, not cursing God, idolatry, incest, murder, theft, and remember it said eating a limb from a living animal, which is also always a funny one. I just want to close by saying that that's the Talmud puts that out there, that Noah had 7 laws, and the tradition sort of seizes on that as a way of answering a question, a really big question that in some ways hovers above this whole conversation, which is, what is the Torah, what is Judaism, what does this tradition have to say about what everybody else in the world is supposed to do? We got these little laws. So that's our worldview, is that we're just going to follow these laws and be in dialogue with God, and everybody else, who knows, who cares? Right? That doesn't seem like. And so one way of answering that question is, oh, no. Everybody has some relationship with God. Everybody has some basic laws they have to keep. Now, I have to say, and I'm just 1 minute over time here, so I will close within the minute, but I have to say, I have always found the Noahide laws idea to be a little silly, like as if we're going to go out and say, hey, everybody, we've got a robust religion, and here's a little bit of it for you, right? It's never really taken off, although some figures, including the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, were really into this idea, because it does solve a problem, which is, do other human beings have no obligations whatsoever, no ethical? Okay, so theologically, you can see how this idea of Noahide laws is a way of saying, okay, I guess the Torah has a message for all of humanity as well. That's important, even if the formulation is a little bit like a little bit particularistic. But I hope that we've seen in this last hour that this idea of Noahide laws isn't just something that the rabbis whipped up in order to solve a vexing question about humanity in a kind of a blunt and simplistic way. No, part of what they are dealing with is the very clear presentation of Noah as someone who is seeding the foundations of the religion that eventually we will inherit. So yes, Abraham is our father and Sarah is our mother, but Noah's sort of our grandfather, isn't he? I mean, let's own that a little bit, right? Noah's part of our story as well. So, all right, our story comes to an end. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Shabbat shalom, and take a listen to the podcast, and I will see you again next week.